The zombie survival roguelike Dead Age 1 by Silent Dreams and Headup Games positively surprised me just shortly after I got quite disappointed by the 2019 release version of Pathway. Yeah, Dead Age 1 looked much cheaper than Pathway, but it was a nice mix of interesting combat and story elements. That game, however, was already released 3 years earlier in 2016 and received quite a few patches during that time. The biggest issue I saw in the game was that with a length of over 20 hours and not much replayability, it hasn't been an ideal candidate for a permadeath feature. In March 2021, the same developer and publisher released Dead Age 2, a successor in the narrowest sense. It takes over the vast majority of game concepts, expands on them here and there, improves the graphics and continues the story where it ended in Dead Age 1. But does that mean that everything is also better now? Well, let's have a look at that in this review. But before we start looking into the game, I want to mention two things. While I usually finish the games I cover in my reviews, that is not the case with Dead Age 2, which is mostly because of the same thing I already criticized in the first game. For a permadeath game, it's just too long with its over 20 hours, especially when in follow-up attempts pretty much everything is identical. You can hardly improve anything and also have no new ways to tackle the same problems. And that's why after 2 tragical deaths at around 2/3 of the game and 44 hours of playtime, I decided to not give it another try, but to move on instead. The second thing I want to mention right away is that I stumbled over various bugs while I played, which have pretty much all been fixed within days after having them reported. And that is why I won't mention these fixed bugs in this review anymore, as you are probably more interested in how the game runs now and not which bugs it had in the past. Time to jump straight into the game, and for now we will also skip the starting settings, which we will check out later on. When we first enter the game, we start with a skippable tutorial, which introduces us to most of the basics. It does leave a couple of things unexplained though, and some elements are just not very intuitive. We do, however, get a good impression of the different main elements, like the quests with plenty of dialogues, traveling the world map, the base management, and of course the turn-based combat into which we will sink most of our time. We also learn that the game is divided into day and night. Whereas at night our HQ can be plundered, we need to set up guards, and we'll also encounter stronger opponents, which you won't necessarily realize anymore after a couple of hours of playtime. One thing which we aren't told is that there's absolutely no time pressure. This means that the game will not become harder over the days, and there are also no time limitations, which is a big difference to the previous game, and which also vastly reduces the necessity to optimize. While I can understand it if they wanted to avoid the usual complaints from players for having a time limit, it strongly contradicts the concept of roguelikes where optimization is a big motivator for new runs. Now, as you got an overview, we'll look into the game mechanics in more detail, and for that it's probably best if I just lead you through a normal day in the game, which always starts at our HQ. Especially in the beginning, it can be useful to first get a picture about which quests you want to do during the day and which characters you will need for that, so that you can set these characters aside for the expedition. This expedition can consist of 3 characters, but it always needs to be joined by the main character. The characters which do not join the expedition should then be assigned to various jobs in the HQ, and for that you will see a couple of rooms and other locations you can click on to have the character work there. That way you can use the tree stand to send the character hunting, you can put him into the smithy to craft some ammunition, and you can assign him to the guard post, where the character will then prevent enemies from stealing your resources. This only happens during the night though, and nights are pretty much working the same as days, so that you can also assign your characters to jobs and do expeditions, and once the night is over, you start with a daytime phase again. The importance of these jobs varies massively. Generally, you could say, of course, if you don't have any food or water left, you got a problem, and in the worst case you can starve to death. Also, crafting ammunition is highly important and should be done in time before your group runs out of ammo and has to limit itself to the weaker melee weapons. Crafting new weapons and armor, however, can be ignored completely until you can craft the very best items in the game, as it's hardly worth the material and time to work on it, if you don't consciously decide on playing super slowly. As I mentioned before, you do not have any time pressure. There's also a room with the radio, which is a bit meh. You can use it to uncover new randomly generated locations for exploration, which costs time and money, and which are basically never used. Utterly pointless, however, is the assignment of a character to the sleeping quarters. Once you switch from day to night or from night to day, your characters will heal up by 50% of their hit points anyways, so that a character who barely dragged himself home with just 20% of his hit points will heal up to 70% for the next segment of the day. And whether you send him to work now or have him rest just makes no difference, as the character can't heal up to more than 100% of his hit points. So this building just can't possibly make any sense, and such rough balancing issues can be found a few more times in the game. Not that it makes a big difference in this specific case, you just won't use the room then. After you assigned all your survivors to do some tasks and also equipped your expedition team, you can go ahead and leave the HQ. In fact, you can also switch back to the HQ at any time during your expedition and reallocate the tasks there among the survivors which stayed back, as long as the segment of the day isn't over yet. So if you don't have enough material yet to craft ammo, but you really need it, you can switch back to the HQ as soon as you found the material and adjust the task for one character. You should just not have this character staying idle in the HQ and then forget about it. Now we switch to a world map, which didn't exist yet in Dead 1, and again plan our goals for the day. Our own HQ is quite central, and around us, in the distance of a few hours of traveling time, we got outposts of all three factions: the Independent, the US Army and the Smugglers. Later in the game we will also discover further cities and the headquarters of these factions, where you can also find additional vendors and quest givers. Quests will mostly dictate what we will do each day. A few quests also come with a time limit, mostly the side quests, which are not relevant and which you can get from the cities, but these are exceptions. Usually we have at least 2 or 3 quests active at any time, and finishing them leads to follow-up quests accordingly, which will also lead us to new locations. I can't really judge the quality of the English text as I played the German version, but it's hard to imagine that the text is less amateurish, especially as German is actually the developer's native language. But it's not like the text is terrible, and in fact the quests do add a lot to the game, as they are designed quite well and you often wonder what will happen next. On the other hand, this is also a part of the problem, as the game does not generate these quests randomly, and you basically have to do exactly the same in case you die and need to restart. I mean, there are a couple of quests with decisions, but that makes hardly any difference, and likely you are going to take the same decisions anyways. So we decided what we want to accomplish during the day and start traveling. We are basically moving from spot to spot into the direction we want to go, and each spot has a traveling distance of 30 minutes to each adjacent one. Spots without icons mean that we will simply travel between them and nothing will happen, besides of some random encounters, including friendly ones. If we reach a location with an icon, however, for example a warehouse, then we'll switch over to a perspective in which we'll do the battles in, but which is also used for exploring the area. Generally, these are always just connected screens, showing like 3 areas in which we will either find something to loot, get a random event, or where we have to fight battles against zombies and other opponents. And with that, we'll have a look into the combat system. Here we see our up to 3 characters on the left side fighting up to 6 enemies on the right one. Combat is turn-based, and we first do all moves with our characters before all enemies get their turn. We cannot, however, switch between our characters. The turn order is fixed. Well, I said we need to plan our moves, but moving is actually not something we can really do, besides of switching positions between back row and front row, which for example is necessary to draw melee attacks on a specific character, and of course also if we want to bash in some heads ourselves. Our characters have up to 4 action points available for these actions, but only get 2 action points at the start of a new turn, so that we would need to save up a few points for the more powerful attacks, which cost 3 or 4 points. We choose the type of attack, which enemy we want to attack, and then we'll see how well we are doing. Missing an attack is neither possible with melee weapons nor with guns. Well, at least you can't miss completely and will always hit with a glancing hit, and these still do 50% of the damage. The choice of which enemy to attack is already somewhat tactical, as all enemies have different abilities, which you might already know from the previous game. For example, we got one suit-wearing zombie, which will call one additional zombie once per turn if they get hit, which means you should ideally kill them within just 1 turn. While the presentation of the descriptions for these enemy abilities could be improved and be more readable, I think you will still get a good impression about the different enemies after a while, including which ones you should kill first. And generally, the combat is also fun. A good change compared to the previous game is that you do not have a healing ability anymore, which you could repeatedly use within combat. This basically meant that in Dead Edge 1 you used to stun the last enemy for as long as needed until you healed up all your characters, though you had to be careful regarding reinforcements. In Dead Edge 2 this is not a thing, so that the combat feels less artificial and gamey. But not everything is great here, and as I mentioned, Dead Edge 2 has some bigger issues with balancing, and this also reflects here. Your characters can either use one of the 3 types of guns, one of the 2 types of melee weapons, hunter and engineer equipment, and depending on how high your character increased these skills, you also got additional types of attacks. Problem is, most of these abilities are just not worth to be used, as they consume 2 or more action points and at the same time do less base damage than 2 standard attacks would do, each costing 1 action point. In addition, a glancing blow also causes a failure of the additional effect for these attacks, which are not super strong in general, often only have a chance to apply, and for which you would also need to speculate on whether an active effect during the rest of the fight would actually be worth it. If, for example, I could just kill an enemy with a couple of basic attacks within 1 turn, it would make no sense to instead decrease the enemy's hit chance, or give him a debuff so that you do more damage on him next turn, or even do more damage with a second character in the same turn, which would possibly require another special attack, which could fail as well. Even more critical are attacks which cost 3 action points, as that obviously is even more prone to bad luck. But in addition, you could only do 1 instead of 2 standard attacks in the first turn, doing half the damage you could do in order to save up the 1 action point you would need for this ability in the next turn. And with that, giving the enemy 1 more turn to attack you. Long story short, in the vast majority of cases, the basic attacks are the best choice, and most of the other abilities can just be ignored. The predecessor is doing a much better job with that, as abilities in there were generally cheaper, the effects more useful, and they could also be combined more easily. Another example for this problem in Dead Edge 2 is a dog which you can summon for 2 action points, which directly attacks the enemy and might even throw it to the floor, so that the enemy is incapacitated for a turn. In the enemy's turn, this dog will then also be targeted, and even if it dies, it will have soaked some damage, which would have hit your party otherwise. But alternatively to the dog, you got a tiger, which you must first unlock, requires tons of skill points, and which takes 3 action points to use. That means that you can only call it in the second turn, meaning that it will not be available in the first, where it would have been most useful. In order to make up for this disadvantage, the battle has to have a certain length, meaning you will first put yourself into a disadvantageous position just to have a small chance for receiving a slight advantage at the end of the fight. And that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense in most cases. I won't even talk about grenades and traps, as they come along with very similar issues. The combat with basic attacks is still interesting, but suffers quite a bit compared to Dead Edge 1 due to the balancing issues, which will also have an impact on the character system, which we will check out next. Once we put down enough zombies, solved enough quests, or completed enough tasks in our HQ, which also reward experience points, our character will have a level up. And this means that he or she will get attribute points, which we can invest into passive character values, like hit points, armor, or damage with different weapon types. But we also receive skill points, which we can then invest into, well, skills. As mentioned before, we got different types of weapons and matching skills for that, but there are also quite a few skills which allow the character to become more effective with tasks in the HQ, to be able to craft more powerful items and also to get a higher chance to lockpick chests on expeditions. I already mentioned the issues with active abilities in combat which require multiple action points, but looking at the setup for the skill progression, we'll see another issue. Between those dark green levels of each skill, which actually unlock new bonuses like these additional attacks, and there are further levels marked in a lighter green. And these skill levels don't give you any advantage at all, which is especially problematic with the weapon skills. Each additional level in a skill costs more than the previous one does, so that you can get the first level with just 1 point, the second costs 2 points, and so on. But in order to do a standard attack with maximal strength, you just need to invest 1 single point. It can make sense to increase the skill to level 3 in some cases, but that's it really. If you don't use the other active abilities anyways, and there are no other benefits from a higher skill level, then increasing the skill also makes no sense. Instead, you now have tons of skill points available, which you can invest into the other skills, which you can then quickly max out, so that you could build the best weapons right away if you just had the materials to do so. You can get the maximum amount of water from the well in the garden, and so on. And this all means that there is another negative aspect coming to these active combat abilities, as using these effectively means that your characters must be less efficient in your other abilities, which actually will have some impact. Speaking of impact, what impact does the death of one of your characters have? As soon as the character drops to 0 hit points in combat, he or she will die, and there's also no option of changing anything at that point. There's no short unconsciousness, an in-between state or anything similar. The character is just done and previously equipped stuff is going into your inventory. All the characters which you receive on the normal way into your group are somehow implemented into the story, and if that dead character had something left in that regard, you will definitely miss it. On the other hand, death isn't really that dramatic, as after the death of any character you will soon have some random encounters with replacement characters which will join your party. Of course, they won't be leveled up as your dead characters were before, but as you don't need tons of points anyways to make them efficient in combat and also useful in your HQ, it's not all that tragical. But it will be tragical if the main character dies. As mentioned, this character has to join every single expedition and therefore also runs into risks more often. And if that character dies, then, well, that's it. Your current run is over and you have to restart. And that's happening more quickly than you might anticipate, and I'd say that's partially also because of the balancing. During most of the time the game is very easy, even on the hardest difficulty level. The damage enemies are doing is relatively low and predictable for the most time. Traveling through an area with weaker or with stronger enemies doesn't feel very different anymore after a while, besides of maybe the first regions with enemies which just drop dead. But as you also have to travel through all types of areas every single day, you will have this fluctuation of difficulty level pretty much all the time. But it generally stays so low that you barely notice the difference. That is, until you run into a problem and something unexpected happens. In both cases where I died with my main character, there was much more incoming damage than I expected. In the second case, I didn't get the 100 or maybe up to 250 damage which I expected, but instead this giant zombie guy just pulverized me with 380 damage. And even that could have been more. 451 damage to be exact, if my character didn't also block a part of the damage. Dying that second time was annoying for 3 reasons. First, of course, because of being unexpected. There wasn't anything which became more tense at that point. I just died. The second reason is because of the game time I sunk into that so far, which was 15 hours. And the third reason is that with another third run, basically nothing would change and be different. While you are playing the game, you do collect achievements, and for them you get medals, which can then be invested to get better starting conditions for the next attempt. But collecting these is basically linear and not branched out. That means that if you get medals 1 to 10 in the first run and die, you will almost definitely need to get past these medals again in your second run before you get the first new one. There's hardly any different routes you can take to get additional medals. At the same time, increasing these starting conditions kinda works as leveling up skills, so that the further you play and more medals you get, the smaller your additional gains will be. And this is also counterproductive, as starting a new game will become more and more off-putting over time. Not just because you lose more and more time, but also because you gain less and less. And completely different approaches are not offered by the game in general. So if I started again after my second death, almost nothing would change to my previous run, and I would do exactly the same for about 15 hours, which is not super motivating. And at this point it's also time to go back to the starting screen, which we skipped in the beginning, and where we can actually decide on the settings and starting advantages. Besides of the looks and name of our character, we can also decide on the difficulty level and activate separate survival options to add some additional difficulty on top of that. We can also choose whether we want to skip the tutorial, and we can decide on what to do with our medals, which I mentioned before. At the start of the very first game we already got 3 of them, which we can invest into any of the 4 categories: melee combat, ranged combat, medical and technical. All of these will grant us a couple of starting items or slight bonuses to some character attributes. And if we decide to completely max out one of the categories, we would also receive some bonus reputation on one of the factions, which gives us the option to take a shortcut for some of the quests. That, however, shouldn't make much of a difference compared to the total playtime of a playthrough. So while the system should work pretty well for players which die after 4 or 5 hours, as you get quite a couple of additional relevant bonuses at the start, it doesn't work at all for players who die after a much longer run. And as I mentioned, I estimate a total playtime of one playthrough of about 20 hours or more, which I think is just too long for a permadeath game, especially if the death isn't really announcing itself so that you can take some last measures, but is just happening from one moment to the other. As there are neither any further relevant improvements from any medals, nor other approaches and paths you can take, I don't see much motivation to restart in that case. But all that doesn't mean it's a bad game. The principle of the game is still working well by itself, and battles are quite fun as optimizing them stays interesting, even though not as interesting as it could be with better balancing. And especially the quests during a normal playthrough are a good motivation to play on and see what happens next. This motivation is getting stomped though if you die after playing for a while. This can happen, but doesn't have to, especially if you're not playing on the hardest difficulty and if you take yourself even more time, though I think that the missing time pressure hurts the game as well. Overall, I will still give the game a 3/4 thumbs up, and a close one at that, but I still think you can have a decent amount of fun with the game, and for the normal price of just 18 euros, I would also recommend it, but you should be aware of what to expect. And that includes that you might not reach the actual ending of the game, but will have fun until you reach your tragical demise. Bugs in the game, which even caused one of my characters to die, are pretty much all patched already, and I would assume that the developer keeps patching and improving the game over the next year or so. So if at some point you can grab the game in one of the sales, it's definitely worth a look. Besides of that, I would still recommend its predecessor, which, while having the same issue with the length and motivation when dying, it does offer the better balancing in combat and therefore also in the character system. And that's it for Dead Age 2. If this review was of any help to you, then I'd appreciate a thumbs up, and if you're new to this channel, then feel free to subscribe to not miss any of my new content, including reviews, previews, let's plays and other stuff in the future. You can also check out my webpage at ndnw.net to have a look at all the games I ever played. While the linked videos are mostly German, the descriptions are English, and you might have fun just to go down memory lane having a look at all the old games with their screenshots. And that's it from me for this time. I'll go into my corner again to cry for another round. Until next time.